On a scorching afternoon in Delhi, 62-year-old Sunita Malhotra stood in her empty family home, the walls stripped bare of the photographs that had chronicled 5 decades of memories. The antique furniture her late husband had carefully collected was gone, sold to strangers who would never understand its sentimental value. In her trembling hands, she clutched a boarding pass to New York City and a heart full of dreams that would soon become the most devastating nightmare imaginable. What could drive a respected grandmother who had raised 3 successful children and survived 43 years of marriage to sell everything she owned for a man she had never seen in person? And why would her desperate search for love again end in a tragedy so shocking that it would expose an international criminal network and change her family forever? If you think you understand how online romance scams work, this story will destroy everything you believe about trust, manipulation, and the terrifying lengths people will go to feel wanted again. Hit that like button right now because this story could save someone you love from the same fate, and make sure you subscribe because what happens next will leave you speechless. Sunita Malhotra was born in 1953 in a small town near Jaipur, where the desert winds carried the scent of marigolds and the sound of temple bells marked the rhythm of daily life. She married Vikram Malhotra when she was 19, a kind-hearted man who worked as a bank manager and dreamed of providing his family with opportunities he never had. Together they moved to Delhi, where Vikram found a position at a government bank and Sunita devoted herself to creating a home filled with love, laughter, and the rich aromas of traditional Rajasthani cooking. Their modest house in Lajpat Nagar became a sanctuary where neighbors gathered for festivals, children played in the courtyard, and Sunita's gentle wisdom helped resolve countless family disputes and neighborhood conflicts. Their 3 children, Kavya, Rohan, and Ankit, grew up watching their mother's quiet strength as she stretched every rupee to ensure they had books, clothes, and opportunities for education. Sunita would wake before dawn to prepare fresh parathas, pack elaborate lunch boxes with love notes tucked inside, and spend her evenings helping with homework while Vikram shared stories from his day at the bank. She learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of their neighborhood, becoming the unofficial counselor for young wives struggling with in-laws, the mediator for property disputes, and the trusted friend who could keep secrets and offer practical advice about everything from cooking disasters to marriage problems. As the years passed, their small house expanded with additions and improvements funded by Vikram's steady promotions and Sunita's careful management of household finances. She maintained a small garden where she grew mint, coriander, and chilies, kept a detailed budget in a worn notebook, and saved money in a steel box hidden behind the rice containers. The children excelled in their studies, with Kavya becoming a software engineer, Rohan pursuing medicine, and Ankit following his passion for business management. Sunita felt immense pride watching them graduate, find good jobs, and eventually move to different cities chasing careers and opportunities that seemed impossible when she was their age. When Kavya relocated to Bangalore for a tech job, Rohan moved to Mumbai for his medical residency, and Ankit found work in Pune, Sunita experienced the bittersweet reality of successful parenting. The house that had once been too small for their growing family suddenly felt enormous and eerily quiet. She and Vikram adjusted to their empty nest by developing new routines, taking evening walks around the neighborhood, visiting temples together, and planning trips to see their children and the grandchildren they hoped would soon arrive. Vikram retired from the bank at 65 with a decent pension and dreams of traveling with Sunita to all the places they had only seen in movies. They talked about visiting Kashmir, exploring the beaches of Goa, and maybe even taking a pilgrimage to Vaishno Devi. For 3 peaceful years, they enjoyed a routine of morning prayers, afternoon naps, and evening conversations on their small terrace overlooking the busy street below. Vikram would often reach for Sunita's hand during these quiet moments, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing after 4 decades of marriage. But at 68, Vikram began experiencing symptoms that he initially dismissed as normal aging. Fatigue, occasional dizziness, and shortness of breath that he attributed to the Delhi pollution and his sedentary retirement lifestyle. When Sunita insisted he see a doctor, the diagnosis came like a thunderbolt that shattered their peaceful world. Advanced diabetes with complications affecting his kidneys and heart. The doctor explained treatment options in medical terms that sounded foreign and frightening, mentioning insulin injections, dietary restrictions, and regular monitoring that would completely change their daily routine. For 2 years, Sunita became Vikram's primary caregiver, learning to check his blood sugar levels, prepare special meals without salt or sugar, and recognized the warning signs of dangerous fluctuations in his condition. She sold her gold jewelry to pay for medications, borrowed money from relatives for specialist consultations, and spent sleepless nights monitoring his breathing and checking his pulse. The children visited when possible, but their own lives had become complicated with demanding careers, young families, and financial obligations that made frequent travel difficult. Kavya called regularly from Bangalore but was dealing with a difficult pregnancy and a husband who traveled constantly for work. Rohan was completing his specialization in Mumbai and working brutal hours at a government hospital that barely paid enough to cover his rent and expenses. Ankit had started his own business in Pune and was struggling to establish himself in a competitive market while supporting his wife and newborn daughter. Sunita understood their challenges and never complained, but she felt the weight of caring for Vikram largely alone, a responsibility that was both a privilege and a burden she carried with characteristic grace and determination. On a humid monsoon morning in July 2015, Vikram didn't wake up from his afternoon nap. Sunita found him peaceful in their bed, his hand still reaching toward her side of the mattress as if seeking comfort even in death. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Vikram had touched during his decades as a respected bank manager and community leader. The children stayed for 3 weeks, helping with arrangements, sorting through their father's belongings, and trying to convince Sunita to move in with one of them. But Sunita refused every offer, insisting that the house held too many precious memories to abandon and that she needed time to grieve in the place where she and Vikram had been happiest. She promised to consider relocating after a few months, once she had processed her loss and decided what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. The children reluctantly returned to their responsibilities, calling daily and visiting when possible, but Sunita could sense their worry and guilt about leaving her alone. After 43 years of marriage, Sunita found herself completely alone for the first time in her adult life. The silence was overwhelming. She would instinctively prepare tea for 2 people, set the table for 2 meals, and wait for Vikram's footsteps on the stairs at 6 o'clock when he used to return from work. The house felt like a museum of their life together, every object holding memories, every room echoing with conversations they would never have again. She tried to maintain her routines of temple visits, market shopping, and neighborhood socializing, but everything felt mechanical and hollow. The children called every day, their voices filled with love and concern, but Sunita could hear the distractions in their conversations. Kavya was dealing with a colicky baby and a husband who had been transferred to a demanding new position. Rohan was studying for important medical exams while working night shifts that left him exhausted and stressed. Ankit was struggling to keep his business afloat during an economic downturn that had affected many small enterprises. When they suggested she move in with one of them, Sunita could sense the hesitation in their voices, the unspoken concerns about space, privacy, and the disruption her presence might cause to their carefully balanced lives. Months passed in a haze of loneliness and routine that felt increasingly meaningless. Sunita would sit on her terrace in the evenings, watching the world continue its busy pace while she felt frozen in time and disconnected from the energy and purpose that had once defined her existence. The neighbors were kind but had their own families and problems to manage. The women her age were either dealing with their own health issues, caring for elderly husbands, or had moved away to live with their children in other cities. It was Ankit who suggested she learn to use a smartphone and social media to stay better connected with the family. During one of his visits, he patiently taught her how to use WhatsApp, make video calls, and navigate Facebook with the enthusiasm of someone introducing a new world of possibilities. At first, the technology felt overwhelming and foreign to someone who had never used anything more complicated than a basic mobile phone, but gradually Sunita began to appreciate the ability to see her grandchildren's faces, watch videos of their first words and steps, and feel connected to their daily lives despite the physical distance that separated them. She joined groups for Indian women her age, cooking enthusiasts, and people dealing with grief and loss who shared similar experiences and challenges. The online world opened up possibilities Sunita had never imagined, allowing her to communicate with people from around the globe, share recipes and household tips with women in different countries, and participate in discussions about everything from traditional remedies to Bollywood gossip. For the first time since Vikram's death, she felt like she had something valuable to contribute, that her opinions and experiences mattered to people who were genuinely interested in her thoughts and stories. It was in one of these groups, a community for Indian seniors and their families, that she first encountered a profile that would completely change the trajectory of her life. The man called himself Michael Thompson, and his profile picture showed a distinguished gentleman with silver hair, warm brown eyes, and a genuine smile that reminded her somehow of Vikram's gentle expression. He claimed to be a 70-year-old retired businessman from Chicago who had spent several years working in India during the 1980s and had developed a deep appreciation for Indian culture, traditions, and the remarkable strength of Indian women. Michael's posts in the group were thoughtful and respectful, often sharing fond memories of his time in Delhi and Mumbai, asking intelligent questions about Indian festivals and customs, and expressing admiration for the wisdom and resilience he had observed in Indian families. His comments on other people's posts were kind and supportive, offering encouragement to those dealing with health problems, congratulating families on achievements and celebrations, and sharing relevant experiences from his own life that showed genuine empathy and understanding. His first direct message to Sunita was simple and polite, complimenting a photograph she had shared of a traditional Rangoli design she had created for Diwali. He mentioned that he had learned to appreciate such intricate art during his years working in India and asked if she might share the story behind the particular pattern she had chosen and its significance in her family's traditions. Sunita was flattered by his genuine interest and responded with a detailed explanation of the symbolism, the techniques her mother had taught her, and the memories associated with creating Rangoli designs for various festivals throughout her life. If you're watching this and starting to feel worried about where this is heading, you should be. Hit that like button if you want to see how these predators operate, and subscribe because understanding their tactics could protect someone you care about from becoming their next victim. Michael's reply was immediate and enthusiastic, filled with thoughtful questions about her family traditions, her experiences raising children in Delhi, and her memories of celebrating festivals over the decades. He shared his own recollections of Diwali celebrations he had witnessed during his time in India, describing the warmth and hospitality of Indian families who had welcomed him into their homes and treated him like family despite being a foreigner. His messages demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Indian culture that went far beyond superficial tourist observations, referencing specific customs, regional variations and traditions, and the deeper spiritual significance of various rituals and practices. What began as a polite exchange about cultural traditions gradually evolved into daily conversations covering everything from favorite recipes and childhood memories to philosophical discussions about life, loss, and finding meaning in the later years of life. Michael seemed genuinely fascinated by Sunita's stories about managing a household on a limited budget, raising 3 successful children while supporting her husband's career, and navigating the complex social dynamics of neighborhood life in Delhi. He asked detailed questions about her daily routines, her relationships with neighbors and extended family, and her thoughts about the changes she had witnessed in Indian society over the decades. Michael shared his own experiences of losing his wife Margaret to cancer 3 years earlier, describing the loneliness of living alone in a large house in an affluent Chicago suburb, surrounded by memories but lacking the daily companionship and shared purpose that had defined his married life. He talked about his struggle to find meaning in retirement after a successful career in international business, his difficulty connecting with American women his age who seemed more interested in his financial status than in building genuine emotional bonds, and his growing sense of isolation despite being surrounded by acquaintances and business associates. Their conversations became the highlight of Sunita's day, giving her something to look forward to when she woke up each morning and a sense of connection that had been missing since Vikram's death. She would spend considerable time crafting thoughtful responses to Michael's questions, sharing stories and insights she hadn't discussed with anyone in months. He seemed to understand her situation in ways that even her own children sometimes didn't, acknowledging the difficulty of widowhood without offering simplistic solutions or rushing to change the subject to more comfortable topics. When Sunita mentioned feeling like a burden to her children, Michael assured her that her love, wisdom, and life experience were precious gifts that any family would treasure. When she expressed frustration about feeling invisible and irrelevant in a society that seemed to value only youth and material success, he reminded her that maturity, emotional intelligence, and spiritual depth were rare qualities that deserved respect and appreciation. His messages arrived at various times throughout the day, which he explained was due to his irregular sleep schedule and the time difference between Chicago and Delhi, but also because he often found himself thinking about their conversations and wanting to share thoughts or questions that occurred to him. Michael began sending good morning messages with photographs of Chicago skylines and Lake Michigan sunrises, sharing articles about Indian history and culture that he found interesting, and asking detailed questions about her favorite places in Delhi, her memories of raising children, and her dreams for the future. Sunita started feeling like someone cared about the details of her daily life again, that her thoughts and feelings mattered to another person who was genuinely interested in knowing her as an individual rather than just as someone's mother or grandmother. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened beyond casual friendship into something that felt increasingly intimate and meaningful. Michael began expressing admiration for Sunita's strength, intelligence, and inner beauty, sending compliments that made her feel like a desirable woman again rather than just an elderly widow whose best years were behind her. He would comment on photographs she shared, telling her how radiant she looked, how her smile brightened his difficult days, and how fortunate he felt to have found such a wonderful friend who brought joy and purpose back into his life after years of loneliness and grief. When Sunita mentioned feeling old and unattractive, Michael would send long, heartfelt messages describing her grace, wisdom, and the way her kindness and intelligence shone through in every conversation they shared. He talked about how refreshing it was to communicate with someone who valued relationships over material possessions, someone who understood the importance of family, tradition, and emotional connection in a world that seemed increasingly superficial and materialistic. The transition from friendship to romance happened so gradually and naturally that Sunita barely noticed when their conversations began including terms of endearment and expressions of growing affection. Michael started calling her "my dear Sunita" and "beautiful lady," while she found herself eagerly anticipating his messages with an excitement she hadn't experienced since her early courtship with Vikram. He would send virtual flowers for special occasions, share romantic poetry that reminded him of her, and express gratitude for bringing meaning and happiness back into his life after years of emptiness and despair. Michael's profile appeared completely authentic, filled with photographs of his life in Chicago, his late wife Margaret, his 2 grown children who lived in different states pursuing their own careers, and his hobbies including golf, reading, and volunteering at a local community center for seniors. He shared detailed stories about his business career in international trade, his travels to various countries for work and pleasure, and his deep appreciation for different cultures and traditions he had encountered throughout his life. His knowledge of India seemed extensive and genuine, referencing specific locations, historical events, and cultural nuances that suggested real familiarity rather than information gathered from internet research. His English was perfect with occasional American expressions and cultural references that seemed natural and unforced. He never asked for money or made inappropriate requests, instead focusing on building a deep emotional connection based on shared values, mutual respect, and what appeared to be genuine romantic attraction. When Michael suggested they begin talking on the phone, Sunita felt nervous but excited about hearing his voice and having real-time conversations instead of waiting for written messages. His voice was exactly what she had imagined, warm and gentle with a slight American accent that made her feel like she was talking to a character from the Hollywood movies she had enjoyed watching with Vikram. Their phone conversations lasted for hours, covering everything from their childhoods and family histories to their hopes and fears about the future. Michael was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful follow-up questions and remembering details from previous conversations that made Sunita feel truly heard and valued as a person. He would call at times that worked with her schedule, always asking if it was convenient and respecting her need to maintain her daily routines of prayers, household tasks, and social obligations. During these calls, Michael began sharing more personal details about his financial situation as a successful retired businessman with a comfortable pension, substantial savings, and a valuable house in an expensive Chicago neighborhood. He mentioned his children's successful careers, his late wife's life insurance policy, and his desire to travel and experience new adventures during his remaining years. He also expressed frustration with American dating culture, describing unsuccessful attempts to find companionship with women his age who seemed more interested in his wealth than in building genuine emotional connections based on shared interests and values. Sunita found herself opening up about her own financial situation, mentioning the house she owned, the modest savings account Vikram had left her, and her concerns about managing expenses on a fixed pension income. Michael was sympathetic and supportive, offering practical advice about investments and budgeting while never making her feel embarrassed or inadequate about her modest circumstances compared to his apparent wealth. He often mentioned how refreshing it was to talk to someone who valued relationships over material possessions, someone who understood the importance of family loyalty, cultural traditions, and emotional intimacy. As their relationship deepened over several months, Michael began expressing a strong desire to meet Sunita in person, talking about visiting India again to experience the culture firsthand and meet the remarkable woman who had brought such joy and meaning into his life. He researched flights, hotels, and tourist attractions, sharing his excitement about seeing the places Sunita had described and possibly meeting her family members who sounded so accomplished and interesting. However, he also mentioned various complications with his travel plans, including health issues that made long international flights difficult and potentially dangerous, visa problems related to his previous business activities in sensitive industries, and family obligations that kept him tied to Chicago during certain times of the year. Instead, Michael suggested that Sunita might consider visiting him in Chicago, painting an enticing picture of American life and culture that sounded like something from a dream. He described the beautiful lakefront city, the diverse cultural communities, the excellent healthcare system, and the opportunities for travel and adventure throughout the United States. He offered to pay for her flight, arrange for her tourist visa, and provide comfortable accommodations in his spacious house with a guest room that would give her complete privacy and independence. Michael talked enthusiastically about showing her Lake Michigan, taking her to Indian restaurants and cultural centers in Chicago's vibrant immigrant communities, and introducing her to his friends who would appreciate her wisdom, grace, and fascinating life experiences. The idea of traveling to America seemed impossible and terrifying to Sunita, who had never been outside India and spoke only basic English beyond her native Hindi and Punjabi. But Michael was patient and encouraging, helping her research the visa application process, connecting her with travel agents who specialized in senior travel, and assuring her that he would handle all the complex arrangements and paperwork required for international travel. He sent her detailed information about Chicago's climate, attractions, and Indian community, making the trip sound not only possible but exciting and enriching. If you're feeling anxious about what's coming next, you should be. This is exactly how these criminals operate, and if you know someone who might be vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, smash that like button and share this video immediately. Subscribe because what happens next will shock you and could save someone's life. As Michael's encouragement continued, Sunita began to seriously consider the possibility of traveling to America for the first time in her life. The idea that had initially seemed impossible started to feel like an adventure that could bring excitement and purpose back into her existence. Michael sent her virtual tours of Chicago, photographs of beautiful neighborhoods, and detailed descriptions of the life they could share together during her visit. He talked about taking her to museums, cultural events, and scenic locations around the Great Lakes region, painting a picture of romance and discovery that appealed to the part of Sunita that had always dreamed of seeing the world beyond Delhi. Michael's messages became increasingly romantic and persuasive, expressing how much he missed her during the hours between their conversations and how desperately he wanted to hold her hand, look into her eyes, and share physical presence instead of just digital communication. He wrote long, heartfelt letters describing his feelings for her, his admiration for her strength and beauty, and his vision of a future where they could spend their remaining years together, traveling, exploring new experiences, and providing each other with the companionship and love that had been missing from both their lives. When Sunita expressed concerns about the expense of international travel, Michael immediately offered to cover all costs, insisting that money was not an issue for someone with his financial resources and that her happiness was worth any amount of investment. He provided detailed information about flight costs, visa fees, and travel insurance, assuring her that he had already budgeted for these expenses and considered them a small price to pay for the opportunity to meet the woman who had transformed his life. Michael also addressed her fears about language barriers and cultural differences, reminding her that he had lived and worked in India for several years and understood the challenges of adapting to a foreign culture. He promised to be patient with her English, to help her navigate American customs and social situations, and to ensure that she felt comfortable and supported throughout her visit. He mentioned that Chicago had a large Indian community with familiar foods, cultural centers, and people who spoke Hindi and other Indian languages, making the transition less intimidating. As their relationship progressed, Michael began sharing more intimate details about his life, including photographs of his house, his neighborhood, and his daily routines. The images showed a comfortable suburban lifestyle with a large, well-maintained home, beautiful gardens, and expensive furnishings that suggested significant wealth and success. He talked about his investment portfolio, his retirement accounts, and his plans to leave his estate to charitable organizations since his children were already financially successful and independent. Michael also began expressing frustration with the limitations of long-distance communication, mentioning how much he wanted to surprise Sunita with gifts, flowers, and romantic gestures that were impossible to arrange from thousands of miles away. He talked about his desire to take care of her, to provide her with security and comfort, and to show her the kind of love and appreciation she deserved after years of sacrifice and service to her family. During one of their lengthy phone conversations, Michael mentioned that he had been consulting with immigration lawyers about the possibility of Sunita obtaining a longer-term visa that would allow her to stay in America for extended periods or even permanently if their relationship continued to develop. He talked about the various options available, including fiancé visas, spouse visas, and other legal pathways that could allow them to build a life together without the constraints of tourist visa limitations. The conversation about permanent relocation initially frightened Sunita, who had never seriously considered leaving India or abandoning the life she had built in Delhi. But Michael was persuasive, pointing out that her children had already moved away to pursue their own careers and that she was essentially living alone anyway. He suggested that she could maintain her house in Delhi as a backup plan while exploring the possibility of a new life in America, where she would have his constant companionship and support instead of the loneliness and isolation she currently experienced. Michael began sending Sunita small gifts through international courier services, starting with flowers, chocolates, and greeting cards that arrived at her door with romantic messages and declarations of love. The packages made her feel special and remembered, providing tangible proof that someone far away was thinking about her and making efforts to bring joy into her daily life. The neighbors began to notice the deliveries and ask questions about her mysterious admirer, which made Sunita feel like a woman with secrets and romance instead of just a lonely widow. As the gifts became more frequent and expensive, including jewelry, silk scarves, and electronic devices, Sunita began to feel overwhelmed by Michael's generosity and increasingly obligated to reciprocate his affection and investment in their relationship. When she mentioned that she couldn't afford to send similar gifts in return, Michael assured her that her love and companionship were the only gifts he needed and that providing for her happiness was his greatest pleasure. However, Michael also began mentioning financial challenges that were preventing him from visiting India or accelerating their plans to meet in person. He talked about temporary cash flow problems related to his investment portfolio, legal issues involving his late wife's estate that had tied up some of his assets, and unexpected medical expenses that had strained his immediate finances. He was careful to emphasize that these were short-term problems that would be resolved soon, but they were creating obstacles to his travel plans and his ability to continue sending expensive gifts. When Sunita offered to help with his financial difficulties, Michael initially refused, insisting that he couldn't accept money from someone with limited resources and that his problems were temporary inconveniences rather than serious crises. But as their conversations continued, he began to share more details about his situation, describing how his investment advisor had made poor decisions that had temporarily reduced his liquid assets, how legal fees for estate matters were higher than expected, and how his health insurance didn't cover certain treatments he needed. Michael's request for financial assistance started small and seemed reasonable given the context of their relationship and his previous generosity toward her. He mentioned needing a few $1,000s to cover legal fees that would release larger amounts from his wife's estate, or temporary loans to cover medical expenses that would be reimbursed by insurance companies within a few weeks. He provided detailed explanations for each request, including documentation that appeared to support his claims and promises of quick repayment with interest. Sunita's first transfer to Michael was 50,000 rupees, sent through a money transfer service to help him cover legal fees that he claimed were preventing him from accessing funds needed for his travel to India. The amount represented a significant portion of her monthly pension, but Michael assured her it was a temporary loan that would be repaid within 2 weeks along with money for her own travel expenses to Chicago. The promised repayment never arrived, but Michael had plausible explanations for the delay, including additional legal complications and bureaucratic problems with international banking systems. He expressed embarrassment and frustration about the situation, promising that everything would be resolved soon and that he would make up for the inconvenience by covering all her travel expenses and providing her with spending money for shopping and entertainment during her visit to America. As weeks passed without repayment, Michael's requests for additional financial assistance became more frequent and urgent. He described escalating legal problems, medical emergencies, and business complications that required immediate cash payments to resolve. Each crisis seemed to build upon the previous one, creating an increasingly complex web of financial obligations that prevented him from repaying Sunita's previous loans or fulfilling his promises to arrange her travel to Chicago. Sunita found herself sending larger amounts more frequently, using her savings, borrowing money from neighbors, and eventually considering more drastic measures to help the man she believed loved her and needed her support during a difficult period in his life. Michael's expressions of gratitude and love became more intense and desperate, describing how her financial assistance was not only solving his immediate problems but also proving her commitment to their relationship and their future together. When Sunita's savings were exhausted and her borrowing options were limited, Michael suggested that she might consider selling some of her assets to provide the larger amounts needed to resolve his legal and medical crises once and for all. He talked about the house she owned, the gold jewelry she had inherited from her mother, and other valuable possessions that could be converted to cash for what he promised would be the final financial assistance he would need before their situation stabilized and they could begin their life together. The idea of selling her house initially horrified Sunita, who viewed the property as her security, her connection to memories of life with Vikram, and her children's inheritance. But Michael was persuasive, pointing out that she was living alone in a house that was too large for her needs, that property values in Delhi were high and likely to continue increasing, and that the money from the sale could provide them with financial security for their future together in America. Michael also reminded Sunita that her children had already established their own lives and careers in different cities, that they rarely visited her in Delhi, and that they would probably prefer to inherit cash rather than property that would be difficult for them to manage from distant locations. He suggested that selling the house would actually be a practical decision that would benefit everyone involved while providing her with the freedom to pursue happiness and adventure during her remaining years. If you're watching this and feeling sick about what's happening to Sunita, you're not alone. These predators are experts at psychological manipulation, and they target the most vulnerable people in our society. Hit that like button if you think this story needs to be shared, and subscribe because understanding how these scams work is the only way to protect ourselves and our loved ones. As Michael's pressure intensified, Sunita found herself caught in an emotional whirlwind that clouded her judgment and overwhelmed her natural caution. His messages became increasingly urgent and desperate, describing how his legal troubles were escalating and how he faced the possibility of losing everything he had worked for during his successful business career. He painted vivid pictures of lawyers threatening to seize his assets, medical bills that could bankrupt him, and bureaucratic complications that were preventing him from accessing his own money when he needed it most. Michael's emotional manipulation became more sophisticated and targeted, focusing on Sunita's deepest fears and insecurities about aging, loneliness, and being a burden to her children. He would remind her of how isolated she felt in Delhi, how her children were too busy with their own lives to provide the companionship she craved, and how this might be her last opportunity to experience true love and adventure before it was too late. He talked about other women his age who had missed their chances for happiness because they were too cautious or too dependent on family members who didn't really understand their needs and desires. When Sunita expressed doubts about selling her house, Michael would become emotional and hurt, questioning whether she truly loved him or was just playing with his feelings during his time of greatest need. He would describe sleepless nights worrying about his legal problems, panic attacks brought on by financial stress, and his growing desperation as deadlines approached for payments that could determine his entire future. He reminded her of all the gifts he had sent, all the money he had spent on international calls and courier services, and all the promises he had made about their life together that were now in jeopardy because of circumstances beyond his control. Michael also began introducing time pressure into their conversations, claiming that his legal deadlines were approaching rapidly and that delays in receiving financial assistance could result in catastrophic consequences that would destroy any possibility of their future together. He talked about court dates, foreclosure proceedings, and medical treatments that couldn't be postponed, creating a sense of urgency that made careful consideration and consultation with others seem like luxuries he couldn't afford. During their phone conversations, Michael's voice would break with emotion as he described his fear of losing everything, including his relationship with Sunita, because of temporary financial problems that could be easily resolved with her help. He would apologize repeatedly for asking her to make such a significant sacrifice, expressing shame and embarrassment about his situation while simultaneously emphasizing how much her support would mean to him and how grateful he would be for the rest of his life. Sunita began to feel that refusing Michael's request would be selfish and cruel, abandoning someone she loved during his darkest hour when she had the power to help him. His descriptions of their future together became more detailed and enticing, including specific plans for travel, comfortable living arrangements, and the security and companionship that would make her remaining years the happiest of her life. He talked about introducing her to his friends and family, showing her off as the remarkable woman who had saved him from despair, and building a life together that would be the envy of other couples their age. Michael also began subtly criticizing Sunita's children, suggesting that their infrequent visits and busy schedules indicated a lack of genuine concern for her welfare and happiness. He pointed out that they had never offered to help her financially, that they seemed content to let her live alone and isolated, and that they would probably be relieved if she moved to America and became someone else's responsibility. He contrasted their apparent indifference with his own devotion and willingness to sacrifice everything for their relationship. When Sunita mentioned that she should probably discuss such a major decision with her children, Michael became agitated and defensive, arguing that adult children often tried to control their parents' lives out of selfishness rather than genuine concern. He reminded her that she was an intelligent, independent woman who had successfully managed a household and raised a family without needing permission from anyone, and that consulting with her children would only create unnecessary complications and delays that could ruin their chances for happiness. Michael also planted seeds of doubt about her children's motivations, suggesting that they might be more interested in preserving their inheritance than in supporting her emotional well-being and personal fulfillment. He pointed out that property values in Delhi were high and that her children might pressure her to keep the house for financial reasons rather than considering what would make her happiest during her remaining years. As the pressure mounted, Sunita began to feel increasingly isolated and confused, torn between her natural caution and her desperate desire to believe that Michael's love was genuine and that their future together was possible. She started avoiding phone calls from her children, afraid that they would ask questions she couldn't answer or express concerns that would undermine her resolve to help the man she believed loved her. Michael's requests for money became more specific and urgent, with detailed explanations about legal fees, medical expenses, and business obligations that required immediate payment to prevent catastrophic consequences. He provided what appeared to be official documents, legal notices, and medical bills that supported his claims and made his situation seem legitimate and desperate. The amounts he needed grew larger as his supposed crises escalated, requiring Sunita to consider more drastic measures to raise the funds he claimed were essential for their future together. When Sunita's liquid savings were exhausted, Michael suggested that she could take out a loan against her house, using the property as collateral to access larger amounts of cash without actually selling it immediately. He provided information about mortgage brokers and financial institutions that specialized in loans for senior citizens, making the process seem simple and reversible if his situation improved quickly as he promised it would. The loan application process required Sunita to provide detailed financial information, property valuations, and personal documentation that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. The amounts available through such loans were substantial, representing more money than she had ever controlled in her lifetime, but they also came with significant risks and obligations that frightened her even as Michael assured her that repayment would be simple once his legal problems were resolved. As Sunita navigated the complex paperwork and financial requirements, she began to feel overwhelmed by the technical details and legal implications of the decisions she was making. Michael was supportive and encouraging, helping her understand the documents and providing advice about how to present her situation to lenders in the most favorable light. He seemed knowledgeable about financial matters and confident about their ability to manage the obligations they were creating together. The loan approval process took several weeks, during which Michael's messages became increasingly anxious and desperate as he described escalating legal pressures and approaching deadlines that could determine his fate. He talked about lawyers threatening to seize his assets, medical procedures that couldn't be delayed, and business partners who were demanding immediate payment of obligations that had become his responsibility after his wife's death. When the loan was finally approved, Sunita found herself with access to nearly 2 million rupees, an amount that seemed enormous and terrifying at the same time. Michael's relief and gratitude were overwhelming, with long messages describing how her love and support had saved him from disaster and how he would spend the rest of his life making up for the sacrifice she was making on his behalf. The first transfer of loan money to Michael was for 500,000 rupees, sent to cover what he described as the most urgent legal fees that would prevent the seizure of his assets and allow him to begin resolving his other financial problems. His expressions of gratitude were effusive and emotional, with promises that this would be the beginning of the end of his troubles and that he would soon be able to repay everything and arrange for her travel to Chicago. But as days passed without the promised resolution of Michael's problems, new crises emerged that required additional financial assistance. His legal troubles seemed to multiply rather than diminish, with new complications arising from previous payments and additional fees required to complete processes that had already begun. Medical emergencies created unexpected expenses, business obligations revealed hidden complications, and bureaucratic delays prevented the release of funds that were supposed to solve his problems. Each new request for money came with detailed explanations and apparent documentation, making Michael's situation seem increasingly complex and desperate rather than fraudulent or suspicious. His emotional appeals became more intense and personal, describing how Sunita's support was the only thing keeping him from complete despair and how their love was being tested by circumstances that would ultimately make their relationship stronger and more meaningful. Sunita found herself sending larger amounts more frequently, using the loan money to cover Michael's escalating needs while trying to manage her own living expenses on her reduced pension income. The financial pressure was enormous, but Michael's promises of repayment and their future together kept her motivated to continue supporting him through what she believed was a temporary crisis that would soon be resolved. As the loan money was depleted and Michael's problems continued to escalate, he began suggesting that Sunita might need to consider selling her house after all, since the loan payments were creating additional financial pressure and the property sale would provide enough money to solve all their problems permanently. He reminded her that she had already committed significant resources to their relationship and that backing out now would mean losing everything she had already invested in their future together. The idea of selling her house still frightened Sunita, but Michael's arguments were becoming more persuasive as her financial situation became more desperate and her emotional investment in their relationship deepened. He talked about the freedom that selling the property would provide, the security of having substantial cash resources, and the opportunity to start fresh in America without the burden of maintaining property in India that she rarely used and that tied her to a life of loneliness and isolation. Michael also began introducing urgency around the house sale, claiming that his legal deadlines were approaching rapidly and that further delays could result in consequences that would make their future together impossible. He provided specific dates and amounts that were needed to resolve his situation permanently, making it seem like the house sale was not just an option but a necessity if they wanted to salvage their relationship and their plans for a life together. If you're feeling angry about what's happening to Sunita right now, you should be. This is exactly how these international criminal networks operate, and they're targeting vulnerable people in every country around the world. Smash that like button if you think this story needs to reach more people, and subscribe because what comes next will expose the shocking truth about who Michael really is and how this criminal operation actually works. As the pressure to sell her house intensified, Sunita found herself living in a nightmare of financial desperation and emotional manipulation that consumed every aspect of her daily life. Michael's messages arrived at all hours, filled with increasingly frantic descriptions of legal deadlines, medical emergencies, and business crises that seemed to multiply faster than they could be resolved. His voice during their phone calls had changed from the warm, confident tone she had fallen in love with to something desperate and pleading that made her feel guilty for every moment she hesitated to help him. The house that had been her sanctuary for decades now felt like a burden and an obstacle to the happiness that Michael promised was waiting for her in America. Every room held memories of her life with Vikram, but Michael's constant reminders about her loneliness and isolation made those memories feel more like chains than treasures. He talked about how the property was too large for one person, how maintaining it was expensive and stressful, and how the money from its sale could provide them with security and freedom that would last for the rest of their lives. Michael's manipulation became more sophisticated as he sensed Sunita's growing desperation and confusion. He began sending her real estate listings from Chicago, showing beautiful condominiums and houses where they could live together, complete with price comparisons that demonstrated how much further her money would go in America. He talked about the excellent healthcare system that would take care of her medical needs, the vibrant Indian community that would help her feel at home, and the travel opportunities that would allow them to see the world together. When Sunita expressed concerns about leaving India permanently, Michael assured her that they could maintain connections to her homeland through regular visits, video calls with her children, and involvement in Indian cultural organizations in Chicago. He painted a picture of a life that combined the best of both worlds, where she could experience American opportunities and comforts while staying connected to her Indian heritage and family relationships. The real estate agent Sunita contacted was initially surprised by her urgency to sell quickly, but the Delhi property market was strong and her house was in a desirable location that attracted multiple interested buyers. The agent explained the process, the paperwork required, and the timeline for completing the sale, which seemed to align perfectly with Michael's increasingly urgent deadlines for resolving his financial crises. As potential buyers toured her house, Sunita felt like she was watching strangers evaluate and judge the life she had built with Vikram. Their comments about renovations, modernizations, and changes they would make felt like personal attacks on the choices she and her husband had made over the decades. But Michael's constant encouragement and reminders about their future together helped her push through the emotional difficulty of the process. The sale price offered for her house was substantial, representing more money than Sunita had ever imagined controlling in her lifetime. Michael's excitement about the amount was infectious, and he spent hours on the phone describing how they would use the money to solve all his problems, establish their life together in Chicago, and create the security and comfort they both deserved after years of struggle and loneliness. But even as the house sale progressed, Michael's financial needs continued to escalate in ways that seemed to consume money faster than it could be provided. New legal complications arose that required additional fees, medical emergencies created unexpected expenses, and business obligations revealed hidden costs that hadn't been apparent in his initial explanations. Each crisis seemed more urgent and desperate than the last, with deadlines that couldn't be extended and consequences that would be catastrophic if not addressed immediately. Sunita began to feel like she was trapped in a nightmare where no amount of money or sacrifice would ever be enough to solve Michael's problems and secure their future together. But his emotional appeals became more intense and personal, describing how her support was the only thing keeping him from complete despair and how their love was being tested by circumstances that would ultimately prove the strength of their commitment to each other. When the house sale was finally completed and Sunita found herself with nearly 4 million rupees in cash, Michael's relief and gratitude seemed overwhelming. He sent long messages describing how her sacrifice had saved him from disaster and how he would spend the rest of his life making up for everything she had given up for their relationship. He talked about immediate plans to resolve his remaining problems, arrange for her travel to Chicago, and begin the life they had dreamed about for so many months. But instead of the resolution Michael had promised, new crises emerged that seemed even more complex and expensive than the previous ones. His legal troubles had apparently triggered additional investigations that required more sophisticated legal representation. His medical condition had worsened in ways that demanded experimental treatments not covered by insurance, and his business obligations had revealed fraud committed by his late wife that made him responsible for debts he hadn't known existed. The amounts Michael needed now were staggering, requiring hundreds of thousands of rupees at a time to address crises that seemed to multiply faster than they could be resolved. Sunita found herself transferring large portions of her house sale money to various accounts that Michael claimed belonged to lawyers, doctors, and business associates who were helping him navigate his increasingly complex situation. As the money disappeared and Michael's problems continued to escalate, Sunita began to experience moments of doubt and fear that she tried to suppress. The rational part of her mind questioned how one person could have so many simultaneous crises, why the problems seemed to get worse instead of better despite the enormous amounts of money being spent to solve them, and why Michael never seemed to have any documentation or proof of the resolutions he claimed were happening. But Michael's emotional manipulation had become so sophisticated and intense that questioning him felt like betraying someone she loved during his darkest hour. He would describe sleepless nights worrying about their future, panic attacks brought on by the stress of his situation, and his growing desperation as he watched their dreams slipping away because of circumstances beyond his control. He reminded her constantly of how much she meant to him, how her support was the only thing keeping him going, and how their love would overcome any obstacle if they just stayed strong and committed to each other. When Sunita's children called, she found herself lying about her activities and financial situation, afraid that they would try to interfere with her relationship or question decisions that she was no longer confident about herself. Michael had convinced her that her children wouldn't understand the complexity of their situation or the depth of their love, and that involving them would only create complications and delays that could ruin their chances for happiness. The isolation from her family made Sunita even more dependent on Michael for emotional support and validation, creating a cycle where his approval and affection became the only things that mattered in her increasingly narrow world. She stopped participating in neighborhood activities, avoided conversations with friends who might ask uncomfortable questions, and spent most of her time waiting for Michael's messages and calls that had become the center of her existence. As her money continued to disappear and Michael's promises of resolution remained unfulfilled, Sunita began to experience physical symptoms of stress and anxiety that she had never dealt with before. She lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and developed headaches and stomach problems that seemed to worsen whenever she thought about her financial situation or tried to understand what was happening to the money she had worked so hard to save and protect. But the most devastating realization came when Sunita tried to contact Michael using a phone number he had given her for emergencies, only to discover that it belonged to a pizza restaurant in Detroit. When she questioned him about the discrepancy, he had elaborate explanations about forwarding services, temporary numbers, and security measures that were necessary because of his legal troubles, but the explanations felt increasingly hollow and unconvincing. Other inconsistencies began to emerge that Sunita could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Photos Michael had sent of his house appeared in real estate listings for properties that were for sale, suggesting that he didn't actually live in the places he claimed to own. His stories about his children contained details that changed from one conversation to another, and his knowledge of Chicago seemed to come from tourist websites rather than personal experience. The most shocking discovery came when Sunita used her smartphone to search for Michael Thompson in Chicago and found no records of anyone matching his description, no business licenses, no property ownership, and no social media presence beyond the profiles she already knew about. The man she had fallen in love with, the person she had trusted with her life savings and her future, appeared to exist only in the digital world they had created together. When Sunita finally confronted Michael with her discoveries, his response was a masterpiece of manipulation and emotional blackmail that revealed the true extent of his psychological control over her. He claimed that he had been forced to use false identities and misleading information because of the legal troubles that were threatening his safety, that the inconsistencies she had noticed were actually evidence of how dangerous his situation had become, and that questioning him now showed a lack of trust that was breaking his heart during the most difficult period of his life. Michael's final manipulation was perhaps the cruelest, as he claimed that Sunita's doubts and accusations were causing him to have a mental breakdown that was affecting his health and his ability to resolve the problems that were keeping them apart. He described being hospitalized for stress-related symptoms, having panic attacks that left him unable to function, and losing hope that their relationship could survive the pressure and suspicion that was destroying their trust in each other. But the truth about Michael Thompson was far more sinister than Sunita could have imagined. The man she had fallen in love with was actually part of an international criminal network that specialized in romance scams targeting vulnerable older women in India, the Philippines, and other developing countries. His real name was Marcus Williams, a 34-year-old convicted fraudster operating from a call center in Lagos, Nigeria, where dozens of scammers used sophisticated psychological techniques and stolen identities to manipulate victims around the world. The photos Michael had used belonged to a real retired businessman named David Richardson who had died 3 years earlier, whose social media profiles had been harvested by the criminal organization to create convincing fake identities. The voice Sunita had fallen in love with belonged to Marcus, who had spent years perfecting an American accent and studying Indian culture to make his deception more believable and effective. The criminal network Marcus worked for had targeted Sunita specifically because of information they had gathered from her social media activity, her participation in online groups, and data breaches that had revealed her financial situation and personal vulnerabilities. They had studied her posts about loneliness, her comments about missing her late husband, and her interactions with her children to create a psychological profile that allowed them to manipulate her emotions with surgical precision. The money Sunita had sent to Michael had been laundered through a complex network of accounts in multiple countries, making it virtually impossible to trace or recover. The amount she had transferred, totaling nearly 6 million rupees, represented the life savings of a woman who had worked and sacrificed for decades to provide security for herself and her family. When Sunita finally realized the full extent of the deception, the emotional devastation was overwhelming. She had not only lost her life savings and her house, but also her sense of identity, her trust in her own judgment, and her faith in the possibility of love and connection in her later years. The shame and embarrassment of being deceived so completely made it difficult for her to reach out for help or support from the family and friends she had pushed away during her relationship with Michael. The criminal investigation that followed Sunita's report to the Delhi police revealed the international scope of the operation and the sophisticated techniques used to target and manipulate victims. But the chances of recovering her money or bringing the perpetrators to justice were minimal, given the complex international nature of the crime and the limited resources available for pursuing such cases. Sunita's story became a cautionary tale that was covered by Indian media and used by law enforcement agencies to educate the public about romance scams and their devastating impact on victims. But for Sunita herself, the publicity only added to her humiliation and made it more difficult to rebuild her life and relationships with the family members who had tried to warn her about the dangers of online relationships. The house she had sold was gone forever, purchased by a young family who had no idea of the tragedy that had led to its availability. The money she had saved over decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice had disappeared into the digital void, enriching criminals who felt no remorse for the lives they had destroyed in pursuit of easy profits. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Sunita's story was not the financial loss, but the way it had isolated her from the people who truly loved her and wanted to protect her. Her children, who had been busy with their own lives but had never stopped caring about her welfare, were devastated by their inability to prevent her victimization and their failure to recognize the signs of her vulnerability and desperation. If this story has affected you the way it should, then you understand why we need to share these warnings with everyone we know. Hit that like button if you think Sunita's story could save someone else from the same fate, and subscribe because these criminals are getting more sophisticated every day, and awareness is our only defense against their manipulation and greed. The elderly people in our lives deserve protection, love, and respect, not exploitation by predators who see their loneliness as an opportunity for profit. Share this video with your family, your friends, and anyone who might be vulnerable to these heartless scams that destroy lives and shatter families around the world.